Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring to life the forgotten and haunting stories of America's past. If you love history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another story from our nation's past. Now, let us take you back to 1881, into the rugged mountains of Colorado, where two sisters stepped out of the shadows of a booming mining town, and into a tale that would make them forever notorious. The town of Leadville, Colorado, in 1881, was a place of rough edges and sudden fortunes. The air was always heavy with coal smoke, whiskey breath, and the clamor of boots striking against wooden walkways. Men came chasing veins of silver, their pockets filled with borrowed dollars, their hearts swollen with the hope that the next strike might turn them from pauper to king. But beneath the rush of wagons and the ringing of blacksmith hammers, the town carried something darker, something that belonged not to dreams, but to shadows. It was into that place that two sisters arrived. Their names would later be whispered with both curiosity and dread: Clara and Minnie Dalton. They came from Missouri, drifting west like so many others, carrying little more than a worn carpetbag, a faded Bible from their mother, and a look in their eyes that said they had learned the hard way not to trust a soul. They were not young, girls by the time they stepped into Leadville, but neither were they old. Clara, the eldest, wore her hair pinned tightly at the back, her mouth often pressed into a thin line that showed little patience for kindness. Minnie, a few years younger, carried a lighter smile, but it was the sort that flickered and died the moment she thought no one was looking. The sisters found work where women often did in such towns, in the saloons. There was a place on Harrison Avenue, a low-roofed building with swinging doors that bore the name the Silver Crown. Its walls trembled every night with music, laughter, and the rattle of coins. Behind the bar, whiskey spilled as fast as it was poured. The Dalton sisters first came as servers, carrying mugs and glasses to tables filled with miners who had no family, no rest, and little care for anything beyond their drink and their luck at cards. But unlike the other girls, Clara and Minnie weren't content to simply serve. They had a certain pull, a certain boldness that made the men pay attention. Clara had a sharp wit that could cut through the smoke-filled room. Minnie had a laugh that rang out above the clamor, drawing the roughest of men like moths to a flame. Soon, they weren't just carrying drinks. They were running the back rooms, handling the flow of whiskey barrels, and whispering into the ear of the saloon's owner, a man named Hank Wallace. Hank was a former miner who had struck just enough silver to trade his pickaxe for a bar rag. He was thick-shouldered and known for his temper. But when the sisters came, he found himself listening to their counsel more than he realized. Before long, townsfolk began saying the Dalton girls were the true masters of the Silver Crown. Men who crossed them found their tabs doubled, their chairs taken, or worse, their luck soured in ways no one could quite explain. Yet it wasn't their rise that made the sisters notorious. It was what happened in the summer of 1881 that would carve their names into Leadville's darker history. That summer had been harsh. The silver mines drew men in droves, but accidents were daily. Explosions underground, men trapped in shafts, wages stolen before they could be spent. The town had grown restless, rowdy, and often dangerous. A string of robberies plagued the area, each one bloodier than the last. Miners staggered into the Silver Crown with pockets full of earnings, only to vanish on the roads at night, their bodies later found stripped and beaten beyond recognition. Some swore it was bandits. Others blamed rival saloons. But whispers soon turned toward Clara and Minnie. No one could prove it, but strange things happened to the men who spent too much time with the sisters. A miner named Patrick O'Rourke was the first. He was loud, proud, and always boasting of a strike he claimed was big enough to bury the whole town in silver. One night, after buying Minnie drinks until her laughter filled the rafters, he stumbled out into the cool mountain air. He never reached his cabin. The next morning, his body was found near the edge of the creek, his skull cracked, his pockets turned inside out. Folks shook their heads, called it robbery. But a boy swore he'd seen Clara walking back toward the saloon in the gray hours of dawn, her dress hem wet and dark. The law in Leadville was thin, stretched between too many crimes and too few men willing to stand against the tide. Sheriff James Boyd questioned the sisters, but their faces betrayed nothing. Minnie wept, said Patrick had been like a brother to her. Clara spoke steady and sharp, insisting the town had no right to accuse two women trying to make an honest living. They were let go, but Patrick's death was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, 2 more men disappeared. Each had been seen in the company of the Dalton sisters. One was found in a shallow grave outside of town. Another never turned up at all, though his boots were later sold in the marketplace by a peddler who claimed he'd bought them from Clara herself. By then, the whispers were no longer whispers. The sisters were said to serve more than beer. What made them dangerous wasn't just the suspicion of murder. It was the way they seemed untouchable. Men feared Clara's stare, a cold and cutting thing that could silence even the drunkest brawler. Minnie's laughter, once sweet, now seemed mocking, as if she knew something everyone else didn't. The Silver Crown was no longer just a saloon. It became a place where fortune could vanish, where men entered with pockets full and hearts eager, only to leave empty or never leave at all. Still, not all avoided them. Some men were drawn all the more, convinced the danger was worth it. One such man was Thomas Avery, a young prospector with sandy hair and a reckless grin. He had come west from Illinois, chasing dreams like so many others. He caught Minnie's eye first, spending long nights at her side, whispering promises of marriage, land, and a fresh start. To all who watched, it seemed Minnie had softened. She walked with him through town, accepted gifts of ribbon and lace. Some even thought the Dalton sisters might settle down, their wild streak finally calmed by love. But then, one night, Thomas vanished. He was last seen leaving the Silver Crown, his arm around Minnie's shoulders. The next morning, his cabin stood empty, his belongings untouched. Search parties combed the hills, but no sign of him was ever found. Minnie wept again, claiming she had no idea where he'd gone. Yet in the days after, she wore a gold chain that Thomas had often shown off as his prized possession. By now, Leadville was on edge. Some demanded the sisters be run out of town. Others argued that without proof, there was no justice to serve. Sheriff Boyd hesitated, knowing the law without evidence was nothing more than mob vengeance. Still, the fear grew. Mothers told their sons to steer clear of the saloon. Fathers muttered that a reckoning was coming. And so, by late autumn of 1881, the Dalton sisters stood at the center of a storm. Their saloon thrived, even as men vanished. Their laughter echoed in smoky rooms, even as coffins were lowered into the frozen earth. People called them the Notorious Sisters of Colorado, and though no jury had named them guilty, the town's heart had already judged. The winter that followed would bring the truth closer to the surface. Snow fell heavy, muffling the town under its white weight. And in that silence, when the air was brittle with cold and fear, the sisters' deadly secret would begin to tear open, piece by piece, until no one could look at the Silver Crown or Clara and Minnie Dalton the same way again. By the time the new year of 1882 edged into the mountains, Leadville had grown restless under the snow. Winter pressed down on the town like a heavy blanket, muffling sounds and slowing tempers, yet the unease never stilled. Men still vanished, sometimes after a night at the Silver Crown, sometimes in the weeks after. No one could draw the line neat and clear, but suspicion had become a steady current that pulled every whisper back to Clara and Minnie Dalton. The sisters, however, seemed untouched by the storm they stirred. The saloon boomed. Men filled the chairs, coins clinked across poker tables, whiskey spilled in golden rivers across the bar. Clara stood behind it like a commander, her hands quick, her eyes quicker, her voice firm when a drunk staggered too close. Minnie, by contrast, floated through the room, light on her feet, her laughter filling the rafters, her hands brushing arms and shoulders in ways that made even hardened miners feel like boys again. But beneath their polished masks, there was a tension building. Those who paid attention noticed Clara's temper flaring sharper than before. She snapped at the barkeep, slammed the books shut when the numbers didn't align. Minnie's smile, too, began to falter. At times she drifted away from the music. And Clara, staring into the snow swirling outside the saloon windows, as though she were remembering something too. Heavy to forget that it was around this time that a preacher came to town. His name was Reverend Samuel Whitaker, a lean man with a voice that could thunder through the frozen streets. He preached of sin, of salvation, of the devil walking in men's boots and women's skirts. His sermons drew miners who hadn't seen a church pew in years, women who longed for a touch of decency in a town swallowed by drink and dice. The Reverend had little love for saloons, and none at all for the Silver Crown. He spoke from his pulpit about the painted sisters of ruin, women who lured men not only from their wages, but from their very souls. He never said their names, but no one needed him to dot it first. The sisters laughed. Minnie mimicked the preacher's booming tone, to the delight of drunk patrons. Clara dismissed him as another man who thought his book gave him power, but Whitaker was relentless. He told mothers to guard their sons, fathers to keep their wages at home, miners to seek their comfort, not in whiskey and false smiles, but in prayer. He had no proof, no law on his side, but his words carried weight, and slowly a crack opened in the sisters' hold over Leadville Dot. It was in the middle of this rift that another death struck the town. This time, it was not a stranger or a passing prospector. It was Hank Wallace, the owner of the Silver Crown, the man who had once given the Dalton sisters their start. On a bitter January morning, his body was found behind the saloon, frozen stiff in the snow. His throat bore a jagged cut, the kind that came from a hand that knew no hesitation. Rumors spun wild. Some said a drunk gambler had done it after losing his wages. Others whispered it was Clara, who had long since outgrown the need for Hank's ownership, who may have decided the saloon should belong to her and Minnie alone. The sheriff again stepped in. He questioned the sisters, his hat pulled low, his voice heavy. Minnie cried, her cheeks flushed, swearing Hank had been like family, that she'd never wish him harm. Clara stood steady, denying any part in his death, though her eyes sharp. As cut glass never softened, the sheriff found nothing to pin on them. No witnesses, no weapon, no proof. And yet, something shifted that day. With Hank gone, the sisters became the undisputed rulers of the Silver Crown. They ran it not as workers, but as queens who had inherited a throne. Clara took the ledgers, the orders, the dealings with suppliers. Minnie took the patrons, the tables, the charm that kept men spending until their pockets turned inside out. But power often feeds suspicion, and the town's whispers grew louder that one man in particular could not let the matter rest. His name was Elias Carter, a miner whose brother had vanished months earlier after leaving the saloon in Minnie's company. Elias was broad-shouldered, his hands rough from years of pickaxe work, and his grief had hardened into fury. He began to watch the sisters. He followed Clara when she went to the market, shadowed Minnie when she strolled by the creek. He whispered to the sheriff that justice was being ignored, that the law was too blind or too afraid to see what was plain. But Leadville was a place where men who pressed too hard often disappeared themselves, and many warned Elias to let it be. He did not listen, Meanwhile, Minnie's heart seemed to falter. Some nights she drank more than she served, her laughter louder, almost desperate. There were moments when her hand trembled as she poured whiskey, when her eyes seemed far away, haunted by ghosts only she could see. A few close enough to notice began to wonder if she was unraveling under the weight of what she carried. Clara, however, grew only sharper, colder. She shielded Minnie when her composure slipped, cut down anyone who dared to question them, and held the saloon together with an iron grip. Then came the night that cracked the secret wide, a poker game. Stretched late into the evening, the room thick with smoke, the air buzzing with anger. A miner accused another of cheating. Fists flew, chairs crashed. In the chaos, a lamp toppled, spilling oil across the floor. Flames licked upward, and for a moment the saloon threatened to burn. Patrons rushed out, coughing, shouting. Amid the frenzy, Elias Carter stormed forward, his face red, his voice booming above the chaos. "This is their doing," he shouted, pointing at the sisters. "Every man who's gone missing, every drop of blood spilled, it's them. And I'll not the devil walk this town any longer." His words cut through the smoke, and for the first time the crowd did. Not laugh, did not brush it aside. They turned, eyes narrowing, toward Clara and Minnie. Clara's jaw tightened, her hand reaching subtly for the knife she kept tucked behind the bar. Minnie paled, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came. The sheriff pushed through, demanding order, but the seed had been planted. Fear had found a voice. That night the sisters did not sleep. Behind the shuttered windows of the Silver Crown they whispered fiercely. Clara spoke of strength, of holding their ground, of letting no man tear away what they had built. Minnie's voice trembled with doubt, pleading for escape, for leaving Leadville behind before the tide swallowed them whole. The argument stretched into the small hours, voices rising, falling, the sound of glass breaking. Outside, snow fell silent, blanketing the town. But inside, the sisters' secret, whatever it was, pressed against the walls like a living thing. Desperate to break free dot by dawn, Minnie sat slumped in a chair, her eyes red from tears. Clara stood at the window, her hand pressed flat against the cold glass, her breath steady. "Let them whisper," Clara muttered, more to herself than to Minnie. "Let them hate. They can't prove a damn thing." But proof, as fate would have it, was closer than Clara knew. The days that followed Elias Carter's outburst were colder than the mountain winds that whipped down from the peaks. Leadville seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. The Silver Crown stayed open, but the crowd was not the same. Where once the room filled with eager miners and wandering drifters, now men sat in silence, their mugs of beer clutched tight, their eyes darting toward the Dalton sisters with suspicion. Minnie felt it first. The stares burned holes in her smile. The laughter she had once given so freely, now catching in her throat. She walked the saloon floor as if through a field of knives, her steps slower, her voice quieter. Clara, on the other hand, stood tall. She poured whiskey with the same steady hand, slammed her fist against the bar when arguments rose, and stared down anyone bold enough to look her way for too long. If she felt the shift, she never showed it. But fear has a way of creeping where even the strongest walls cannot keep it out. The whispers of the town grew into stories. Mothers told their children the Dalton sisters lured men to their deaths. Miners swore they saw bloodstains behind the saloon, or heard screams in the night that were swallowed by the snow. The preacher, Reverend Whitaker, thundered louder than ever from his pulpit, calling the sisters the Black Heart of Leadville, women who had traded their souls for power. The sheriff could not ignore it any longer. He gathered a small group of deputies and searched the grounds of the Silver Crown. For hours they scoured the rooms, pried up floorboards, checked the cellars. Clara stood with her arms crossed, her eyes hard as steel. Minnie wept, clutching her handkerchief, begging them to see reason. At first, nothing turned up. The deputies began to mutter, shaking their heads, ready to call it another false chase. But then one man, digging behind the saloon near the stables, struck something hard beneath the frozen earth. They cleared away snow and soil until the truth lay bare, a shallow grave, a man's boots sticking from the dirt. His body, though frozen stiff, was not yet unrecognizable. It was Thomas Avery, the prospector, who had once promised Minnie a new life. The town erupted. News spread faster than wildfire. Men stormed the streets, demanding the sisters be jailed. Women crossed themselves in fear, whispering of demons. The sheriff had no choice. Clara and Minnie Dalton were arrested on the spot. The sisters were. Dragged through the snow, the crowd pressing close on either side, shouting curses, spitting, some throwing stones. Clara kept her chin high, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Minnie sobbed openly, her body shaking as the people she once charmed now hurled hatred at her like fists. Inside the jail, the truth began to peel away. Under questioning, Clara said little, refusing to answer more than a few clipped words. Minnie, however, cracked. Her sobs filled the cold stone room. At first, she denied everything, swearing she knew nothing of Thomas's fate. But as hours passed, her words tumbled into contradictions. She claimed Thomas had left town of his own will. Then she said Clara had argued with him. Then she fell. Silent, her hands covering her face, Elias Carter demanded justice. He stood outside the jailhouse, night after night, calling for the sisters to hang. The Reverend thundered at the townsfolk that God's wrath would fall if blood was not repaid with blood. The sheriff, caught between the fury of the crowd and the thin thread of law he was sworn to uphold, called for a trial. The trial was held. In the town hall, the largest building that could hold the sea of people who demanded to see the sisters face judgment. The room smelled of damp wool, tobacco smoke, and fear. Men crammed shoulder to shoulder, women pressed against the walls, children clutched tightly in their mothers' arms. The judge, a weary man with sunken eyes, pounded his gavel for silence. The evidence was laid bare. Thomas Avery's body, the gold chain Minnie now wore around her neck, the witnesses who swore they had seen men vanish after nights at the saloon. Each piece was small, but together it painted a picture darker than any fiction. The prosecutor's voice rang with fury, calling the Dalton sisters vipers who had lured men into their web and bled them dry. Minnie sat trembling, tears streaking her face, her hands twisting in her lap. Clara sat straight, her face carved from stone, her eyes daring anyone to look at her too long. When Minnie was called to the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice cracked as she swore she had never meant harm, that she had loved Thomas, that she had begged Clara to let him go. The crowd gasped. Clara's head snapped toward her sister, her eyes burning with betrayal. For a moment, it seemed Clara might leap from her chair. But she stayed seated, her lips pressed into a line so thin it seemed it might vanish altogether. The trial stretched for days, each testimony another nail hammered into the sisters' fate. Some swore they had seen Clara sneaking out at night. Others told of Minnie leading men away, never to be seen again. The sheriff himself admitted he had long suspected foul play, but lacked the proof until now. By the end, the outcome was no mystery. The jury returned swiftly, their faces grim. Guilty. Both sisters guilty of murder. The sentence, death by hanging. The announcement sent a shiver through the hall. Some cheered, raising fists and voices. Others wept, unable to believe the women who had once charmed the town could be brought so low. Minnie collapsed into sobs, her hands shaking as deputies pulled her from the room. Clara stood tall, her face unreadable, her eyes like cold fire. Execution was set for the spring, when the thaw would loosen the ground and the gallows could be raised. Until then, the sisters were kept in the jailhouse, their days spent in silence. Clara spoke little, but when she did, her words were sharp, filled with contempt for the town that had turned against them. Minnie wept often, her eyes swollen, her hands clutching the Bible their mother had once given them. Yet even in those cold stone walls, their story did not rest. For beneath Minnie's tears and Clara's defiance, the truth of what had really happened still lingered, hidden, waiting to claw its way to the surface. And as the snow melted and the earth softened, Leadville braced itself. For when the gallows rose and the sisters faced the rope, the final secret behind the bar of the silver crown would not only be whispered, it would be revealed in full, a truth darker and more haunting than the town had ever feared. Spring came late to Leadville that year. The snow thawed slowly, running in muddy rivulets down the streets, carving paths between the wooden shacks and saloons. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of wet pine and coal smoke. But beneath the slow rebirth of the town lay a grim anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. The gallows were built at the edge of town, a rough frame of timber raised high against the sky. Each hammer strike that echoed over Leadville drove the weight of fate deeper into the hearts of those who listened. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers muttered that justice was finally being done. But not everyone celebrated. Some spoke in hushed voices that no woman had ever been hanged in Colorado before. To see two sisters taken to the rope would stain the town forever. In the jailhouse, the sisters awaited their end. Clara, unbending as ever, paced the cell like a caged wolf. Her eyes remained sharp, but her cheeks had hollowed. Her hands trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was watching. Minnie had withered more openly. She spent hours clutching the Bible, whispering prayers that tumbled into tears. Her once bright laughter had gone silent, replaced by the low murmur of sorrow. It was Minnie who first broke beneath the weight. Days before the hanging, she called for the sheriff. With trembling lips, she confessed in fragments, her voice wavering as though she feared the shadows might punish her for speaking. She said it was Clara who had led them into darkness, that Clara had slit Hank Wallace's throat in the snow, that Clara had demanded silence, that Clara had forced her to lure Thomas Avery and the others with promises of warmth and affection. I never wanted it. Minnie wept, her eyes swollen. I loved Thomas. I begged her to let him live. But she said he knew too much, that he'd ruin us. She made me watch. The sheriff listened, his jaw set tight, his eyes heavy with the burden of truth. He knew the confession would change nothing. The sentence was already passed. But Minnie's words spread quietly, carried on the lips of guards and deputies, until the town too began to whisper. Perhaps Minnie had only been a pawn. Perhaps Clara had been the hand of death all along. Clara denied it all, her voice hard as iron. She's weak, she spat when told of Minnie's confession. She always was. Don't believe her tears. She chose every step as I did. The sisters were kept apart in those final days, their voices no longer rising together, but cut off by the stone walls between their cells. Minnie prayed for forgiveness. Clara cursed the town that had turned against her, cursed the men she claimed, had used them, cursed the gallows that waited. The morning of the execution dawned gray, the clouds low, the air sharp with chill. A crowd gathered early, their breath steaming as they pressed close around the wooden frame. The sheriff led the sisters out together, their wrists bound, their skirts brushing against the wet earth. Minnie stumbled, her face pale, her lips trembling. With prayers, Clara walked tall, her head high, her eyes burning with defiance. Every step measured, as though she were marching to battle rather than death. The crowd fell into a hush as they were led up the steps. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Some men removed their hats. Others sneered, muttering curses beneath their breath. The judge read the sentence aloud, his voice steady, though his hands trembled as he held the paper. Murder, robbery, blood, spilled on Colorado soil. Punishment by hanging until dead. Minnie broke first. Her knees buckled, tears streamed down her face as she cried out to the crowd. "I never wanted it. I never wanted any of it. It was Clara. She made me do it. Please, please forgive me." Her voice cracked into sobs that carried through the silence. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some muttered that she deserved mercy. Others shouted that her tears could not wash away the graves she had helped dig. Clara turned toward her sister, her face twisted with fury. "Stop your whining," she hissed, her voice sharp enough for those nearby to hear. "You were no victim. You wanted the gold. You wanted the whiskey. Don't put this all on me." The sisters locked eyes for one final moment. The bond that had once held them together, now torn apart, each blaming the other in the shadow of the rope. The nooses were lowered. The rope scratched against their necks, rough and unyielding. Minnie sobbed, whispering prayers, her lips moving quickly as though she could outrun judgment. Clara stood silent, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, cold and burning, until at last she fixed them on Elias Carter. He stood at the front, his jaw set, his fists clenched, the grief of his lost brother carved into every line of his face. Clara held his gaze until the hood fell over her head. The crowd waited. The sheriff gave the signal. The trapdoor fell. The sisters dropped. Minnie's cry cut short. Clara's body snapped taut against the rope. The gallows creaked, the silence heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind cutting across the mountains. When it was done, the sisters hung still, swaying slightly in the breeze. The crowd watched, some in grim satisfaction, others in uneasy sorrow. For even in their guilt, there was something terrible in watching two women sisters swing together in death. Their bodies were cut down and buried on the edge of town, unmarked graves sinking into the earth. The Silver Crown Saloon closed its doors. Its windows darkened, its rooms left empty. Some said at night they could still hear Minnie's laughter, faint and broken, drifting through the walls. Others swore Clara's cold gaze followed them from the shadows when they passed the old building. As months passed, Leadville moved on, as towns always did. New miners came, new dreams rose, new sorrows fell. But the story of the Dalton sisters lingered. Mothers told it to warn their daughters of temptation. Fathers told it to caution their sons about dangerous charms. The preacher told it to thunder against sin. And old men told it with a shake of the head, saying the sisters had been both victims and villains, carved by the hardships of the world, until they had become something neither heaven nor earth could forgive. In the end, the truth lay buried with them. Whether Clara truly led every act, whether Minnie's tears were real or only another mask, no one could say with certainty. What remained was the memory of two women who came to a booming mountain town with nothing, who built a life from whiskey and charm, and who left behind a legacy steeped in blood and fear. And so, in the annals of Colorado's Wild West, the names Clara and Minnie Galton endured not as heroines, not as martyrs, but as the Notorious Sisters of Leadville, whose deadly secret behind the bar cast a shadow that no snow, no sermon, and no gallows could ever fully erase.